Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative, and United University Professions, representing 37,000 academic and professional employees at SUNY campuses and teaching hospitals across New York State. Frederick E. Cole, President, uupinfo.org. It's the Capital Connection. Hi, I'm David Gustina. This week we're joined by, this is a man who is a savant. Emphasis on savant. Blair Horner, the executive director of the New York Public Interest Research Group, or NYPIRG. You can find out more at NYPIRG, NYPIRG.org. And in the interest of full disclosure, Blair does commentary for WAMC, where this program emanates from, and serves on our board of trustees. He's not my boss, though, so at the very least...
No one is your boss.
That's right. I'm my own boss until I'm not. He's back again. Welcome back, Blair.
Like a bad penny.
Nah. You're way.
Did they
like
make pennies anymore?
I don't know. I have some in a jar at home, and I haven't seen them outside of a jar in a long time.
Well, I mean, we're moving increasingly towards sort of a plastic-based economy, in terms of using credit cards. And so how often do you even see cash, much less pennies?
Right. Remember when we had the quarter dollar, the dollar that everyone confused? Was it the Susan B. Anthony dollar quarter thing? That went south really quick. But this has nothing to do with what we need to talk about, Blair, unless we need to talk about it. Unless we need to talk about plastic.
Well, that's true, too.
Right? So,
too much plastic.
You've got this packaging bill. It's too much packaging. The Packaging Act. And in fact, this very day that we're speaking, Blair, your organization has a rally at the Capitol on this. And I just pulled the numbers from the Siena poll that came out this morning, just to give you a little extra here. 82% of voters say single-use plastic packaging is a major, 47%, or minor, 35% problem, while only 14% say it is not a problem. By 67 to 22%, voters support the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Act, including support from more than 3/4 of Democrats, 2/3 of independents, and a plurality of Republicans. That has to make you feel a little more positive.
Well, yes and no, right? There's a reason why it doesn't make me feel positive, which is plastics are ubiquitous. It's in our bloodstreams.
Microplastics.
It's just, it's a terrible thing. By the year 2050, according to the experts, there'll be more plastic in the ocean than fish by weight in 30 years.
Yet we're having sensational headlines. They're not going to let us individually wrap cheese slices.
I know. Like no one has ever heard of wax paper or a knife.
Or bi-block cheese.
Right, exactly. I mean, again, the opponents always sort of reach for this culture war lever. Like, how do you get people revved up about something, even though it's really ridiculous? Like, individually plastic-wrapped slices of cheese, or cheese products, let's say. I don't think the future of Western civilization hinges on whether or not we have that or we have to use a knife like we did back in the old days. The problem is really that plastic is used everywhere. I mean, if you think back, I can certainly think back to when I was a kid. I mean, it wasn't like everything was plastic.
No.
Every toy was plastic. Every packaging was plastic. People's furniture wasn't plastic.
We used to get our soda and our milk in glass bottles.
That's right. And we'd return them.
That's correct.
And so it is, it's back to the future time, but we have to stop using as much plastic as we do because it creates mountains of trash that have to be disposed of, and it ends up too frequently in our environment and then in us.
Well, I was talking to Senator Liz Krueger, of course, a progressive from Manhattan, and she wants this bill passed. And, she makes all the correct arguments that you do. But when we got to the individual cheese slices issue, she pointed out that this legislation won't trump federal legislation on plastics, which to me meant we're going to see individually sliced cheese for a long time to come.
It's hard to believe that we're talking about who cut the cheese, right? In terms of what we need to do, if you look at New York State has, and much of the rest of the country does too, two major crises in the environment. One is climate change, of course, and the other is solid waste crisis. According to the DEC, no later than 25 years from now, all of the landfills in New York State will be closed. Could happen as soon as 16 years from now. And where does it all go then, right? It's going to go to someone else's landfill in some other state. It's going to cost a hell of a lot more money than it costs now to dispose of it. And at some point, those people may be like, well, sorry, we don't want any more New York waste. It's time now, while we can see the horizon, it's a short timetable in reality, things have to change. And what the DEC talks about in their solid waste master plan that came out at the end of December is movement to what's called a circular-based economy, where you sort of focus on redemption of materials or recycling of materials or reuse of materials and reduce the amount of trash that goes to landfills to extend the life of them. And so the packaging legislation basically says that we're going to reduce the amount of plastics that's being used, we're going to reduce the amount of toxics that exists in the ink on packaging, and there's going to be a system in place to reduce the amount of waste that's produced by packaging generally. And so that all makes sense. That's all consistent with science and what the needs are of the state. And so therefore, we hope it happens.
But when I talk to Republicans like Assembly Minority Leader Will Barclay, they make this argument like, well, New York's one state, and what if somebody has worse pollution or emissions and that's going to cost New York? I tell him this. He knows I don't agree. But how can, when he sees, a politician like that sees in this poll a plurality of Republicans support this packaging act, how are you not in tune with that?
Well, there are polls like what Siena did, and, the people that get polled, how do they respond to specific questions? It's not necessarily the intensity of how they care about the issue. Again, I can't speak for the Republicans or Democrats because I'm not on either team. But in terms of their internal polling, there must be things that show up that it makes sense to them to argue against things that seemingly are common sense proposals.
Well, Kruger said straight out, industry lobbies and spends a lot of money to stop legislation.
That's right.
Like this.
And from the Republicans' perspective, they need money to challenge incumbents, although New York State now has a public financing system, which they can always use if they want to. And they have an ideological orientation that tends to be what's called pro-business. Now, in this case, pro-business is, in our view, would be to look ahead. What is the environment that we're all going to have to live in? And how much taxes you're going to have to pay to have your waste hauled to Indiana or Malaysia as compared to having a system based on recycling? So it doesn't make any sense. It's very short-sighted. But, often elected officials, politicians, tend to be short-sighted because they're looking at the next election in 6 months.
And that's exactly what we're at right now, in the sense that we're in a presidential election year, right? We can't expect a lot of things to get done in a hyper-political environment.
Well, hope springs eternal, Dave.
For you.
At the state legislature, I expect that there will be lots of things happening and that hundreds of bills are going to get passed over the next couple of weeks. The question is, will they be consequential and meaningful in terms of dealing with the problems of the state or not? And as I mentioned, there are two big crises facing the state. One is dealing with climate change and the other is dealing with solid waste.
Well, you came in the building this morning. What was it, about 300 degrees when you walked through the entryway? It is a blistering heat wave in May right now as we sit here speaking, and you have something called the New York Heat Act. And, utilities. We've seen all sorts of problems with utilities, basically monopolistic in many ways, and there are too many people who are suffering without having enough heat in the winter, never mind the amount of money that in many cases they just can't afford it.
Yeah, energy costs are not going to go down anytime in the near future unless we move entirely to a solar-based system, because the sun obviously doesn't cost much in terms of accessing sunlight. When it comes to things like climate change, of course, the problem is a global problem. It's not quite the same as solid waste, because solid waste, we control what happens within our borders. And if we have to ship the stuff out of the state, it's going to cost a lot more money. When it comes to climate change, we're all in the same soup. It'll have different impacts. So if you're living along the coast anywhere in the world, you're going to have serious problems already due to sea level rise, and it's going to get worse. There's no getting around it. It's only going to get worse.
And so a lot of that is infrastructure.
So, there'll be enormous costs to dealing with the more intense storms, the rising sea levels, the intense heat. Here we are in the Northeast. The winters are getting shorter all the time.
Fire smoke.
That's right. Last year we got to see orange skies because of Canadian wildfires, which, by the way, didn't go out even in the winter this year.
No, and are still going right now in the western part of the country, but we can expect more this summer, I bet.
That's right. If the fires don't go out all winter, when they, things dry out and the snow melts away, they're going to fire up again. Now, maybe the Canadians will be more on top of it this time than they were last year. Maybe it'll be a rainier summer than it was last year. Whatever, hopefully. Nevertheless, those fires will burn, and whether or not we have to inhale that is really going to be the question. So there's a lot of things that have to happen, and there's two different major climate initiatives before the legislature in the last couple of weeks. One is what you mentioned, something called the New York Heat Act, which, among other things, eliminates the current utility ratepayers subsidy for the natural gas hookups for people who want to get a natural gas hookup. So Blair Horner has a house. He wants to get connected to the gas main. You, Dave Gastina, pay for me to do that.
Yes.
And so this proposal, among other things, gets rid of that and says, well, if you want it, you have to pay for it, not all ratepayers. And it's about a $200 million fiscal hit in terms of what utility ratepayers have to pay. The second issue is really sort of the infrastructure question. What do you do about needing more air conditioning in schools? What do you need about bridges that get washed away due to storms? What do you deal with? How do you protect lower Manhattan from rising sea levels? All of those costs are enormous. I'll give you one example. Just to upgrade the New York City sewer system to handle more intense storms. It was designed for rainstorms that occurred 100 years ago. That's a $100 billion cost. That's not the MTA. That's not protecting lower Manhattan. That's not dealing with Long Island, which is getting increasingly washed away. That's not dealing with the Great Lakes. That's just the sewer system of the city of New York, $100 billion.
And a lot of these will be billions and billions of dollars.
Right. There's no getting around it. And the public policy of the state of New York is to make the taxpayers pick up the tab. Now, there's legislation.
We need a new deal is what we need.
That's right. We need that.
I'm referencing FDR here. This is the kind of money you need to get this country prepared.
And again, there's no getting around it. Someone has to pay right now. The public policy, particularly in New York, thanks to Governor Hochul, is to make the taxpayers pay. There is legislation that's under consideration past the Senate. It has 76 of 101 Democrats as sponsors in the Assembly that would make big oil pick up the tab. And yet it's running into, as far as I can tell, problems with the Assembly leadership despite the overwhelming support. And
so what's that about? Let me stop you there, Blair. You got super majorities in the legislature. You got a Democratic governor and 2 Democratic leaders of each house, and this can't get done?
Yeah, I mean, it's really sort of amazing, right? I mean, it's passed in the budget. The Senate put it in this proposal in their one-house budget bill, and the Assembly had language in their budget resolution which was consistent with it, although they didn't have the proposal. It didn't happen. So by deduction, who could that be, right? That has to be the governor. So why would the governor not want the oil companies to pick up at least a portion of the tab for all of the tens of billions of dollars that New York taxpayers are on the hook for? I have no idea. It doesn't make any sense to me substantively. It doesn't make any sense to me politically. It's not like we're in Texas. So we're not one of the big oil producing states in the country. So I don't know what it is. The argument is, well, the costs will be passed on to the public. And we think that that's not true. And we have independent studies to prove it, but it doesn't seem to matter. They did pass Cap and Invest, which is a system of taxing polluters and using that money to sort of re-engineer the state's economy to make it greener, which, by the way, we supported. But that does get passed on to consumers, absolutely, and they supported that. But they're not willing to support something which oil companies, which are ridiculously profitable right now, to pick up some of the tab. And they're responsible because they lied about it for the last 4 decades about the problem. If we had attacked global warming in 1985, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in today.
Do you have any sense of why people react this way to this?
I mean, it has to be, the lobbying of the bad guys. I'll put the big oil companies in the bad guy category. They are fabulously wealthy. Over the last 3 years, the profits of the big 7 are almost $1 trillion profit. So, the whole world is going to be looking for some scratch to pay for the costs of climate change. Why not use their profits and wind down their business model? Because you have to stop using fossil fuels anyway.
Let me ask you a philosophical question. How much of this comes down to people's interpretation of what capitalism means when you start putting rules and regulations on corporation? This is what they always argue. The free market. Yeah. But we see what a free market has done to the earth.
Yeah, I know. I mean, people grasp for straws to make arguments that fit into their ideology sometimes. I mean, there is something called a Superfund program right now for toxics that get dumped into the Hudson River or onto the ground. And the idea was make the polluter pay, protect the taxpayer. It's not the taxpayer's fault that someone dumps PCBs into the Hudson River. It's not the public's fault that Exxon is responsible for over 1 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, we benefited from the products, but in the case of global warming, we were lied to. There were full-page ads run on the New York Times talking about, well, the science isn't clear, chemistry is your best friend. And all of that stuff led to nothing happening. And now we're suffering the consequences with unbelievable heat across the Middle East and India and Africa. The countries that actually had very little to do with global warming are the ones taking it on the chin first.
So how do you have hope?
Well, you have to hope that democracy works. And the only way for that to happen is for people of goodwill to participate and not get cynical. Because if you leave it to just the powerful interest groups to make all these decisions, then the average person gets screwed. And that's not fair.
But we're not having a fair shot at information as much as we used to have. We're seeing what's happening in the social media world and many of the partisan media that's out there, in the disinformation campaigns, in other countries hacking us and causing problems, and AI now entering the scene. You're really, when it comes to verified information, we're in a real difficult space as we go forward. And I wonder how much that's going to hurt democracy.
Well, it certainly could. There's no getting around it. Propaganda has been used for a long time to influence elections, and now we have a much more sophisticated way of doing that with deep fake videos, et cetera.
You can just see the political consultings they're licking their lips, ready to get a hold of getting their competitors in some deep fake thing scandal.
Yeah, and it definitely will happen and has happened.
Yes.
But it doesn't always work, and what you need is, of course, a free, independent media, both for-profit and not-for-profit, such as WAMC, to call balls and strikes. And there's really, that's where the system sort of hinges. The cornerstone of democracy is effectively based on getting decent information from unimpeachable sources, and to the greatest extent possible, that should be the media. So that's the challenge.
And it wasn't us. The founding fathers put it in the Bill of Rights.
That's right. And they didn't even know that radio would exist in those days.
They had no idea.
So it really matters to the stations, like particularly the public radio stations and public television stations, to make sure that they do that, because they are organized in the public's best interest. And so they have to deliver the goods.
I thought it was interesting that the legislature put a bill through to help local media.
That's right. Well, there's no getting around what's happening. And when you have media deserts, you're much more likely to have people that are relying on the propaganda to make their decisions, and that does erode democracy and increases corruption.
We're speaking with Blair Horner. He's the executive director of the New York Public Interest Research Group. And Blair, as we speak today on May 22nd, 2024, this is your anniversary. 45 years at NYPI. What were you thinking when you signed up?
I was thinking it would be a one-year thing and that I would go on to do bigger and better things. But like Peter Pan, I continue to be stuck here in my green tights.
I don't think you're aging either. I mean, you just really, you keep this thing going. You stay hopeful, even though everything suggests that
Not everything, David. See, the thing is you can focus on the negative or you can focus on the positive. There are good things that happen. Most people have common sense. Most people want to see the right thing happen. Most people are concerned about the mounting piles of trash that they have to pay for, and that creates problems in their bloodstream and can lead to cardiac problems. Most people do care about the fact that winter is evaporating, and that's going to lead to migration, which has already started. I mean, there's been a drought in Central America that contributes to the mass effort by migrants to come to the United States. People understand that all those things are happening, and so I have confidence in the common sense of the American people.
Yes, and I think you're right. The common sense of the American people agrees with you. The problem is that the representative democracy we live in requires a legislature and representatives to respond to those constituents and do the right thing by them. But they get colored by other things.
But that's always been happening, right? There was something called the Gilded Age. There was something called Watergate. I mean, it's not like democracy is a work in progress, and that work in progress will always continue. We just have to keep at it.
You wrote an interesting column, a commentary you did.
And for those of you who are listening, this is a first. I'm going to go out and buy a lottery ticket that David says that he liked one of my commentaries.
I like all of your commentaries. Are you kidding? I want you to be as animated as you are on the show. That's the issue.
I can't help myself.
I know.
I do this first thing in the morning.
I understand.
I'm only on my third cup of coffee.
You got to have more coffee before you do it. But it is important that we talk about this, because I always wonder why elected officials, especially state officials, travel to other countries, and they always have to justify these trips. And we're learning this thing, and we're sharing that thing, and we're going to partner on this thing. Well, to that end, the governor and other electeds have been visiting the Pope, and she is on a climate alliance. She's part of this U.S.
The governor is a she, just for those of you who are listening, not the Pope.
Not the Pope, correct. Thank you, Blair. Thank you so much.
With a name like Christina, you think you would just want to make sure everybody knows that.
Yeah. Della Justina, the original Italian, and I certainly know Pope Francis. But the governor visiting the Pope, is it a necessary trip? You wrote a little, you talked about it.
The governor was just appointed earlier this month as the co-chair of the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is a bipartisan coalition of governors. So she was appointed. And so in that capacity, she went to see the Pope because the Pope was having a meeting at the Vatican dealing with climate change. And so some of the key people that were, in the climate movement in the United States spoke. So, and France too, the mayor of Paris spoke as a keynote. Governor Newsom of California spoke. Governor Hochul of New York spoke. So it was that kind of event. And when you do that, when you become a high-profile person, it's an opportunity to look at the record. And that's what the commentary really was focused on, is that New York, despite having aggressive, science-based climate goals, is not on pace to meet them. And that not only is a problem with the law, right, but it's a problem in terms of the climate. I mean, New York has one of the biggest economies in the world. New York has a bigger economy than Canada, which it does. It makes sense that states would be featured at the Vatican, but it also makes sense for the states to do things. And so, for example, the governor of California was talking about how it's been over a month of the energy in California being based on non-renewable sources every single day. Now, California has more sunlight.
Incredible.
But, still they did it, and we're nowhere near close to that.
Well, Blair, you're sitting here on a day when you're about to go listen to the State of Higher Education address in New York, and I'm wondering, they talk a good game when the budget comes out. They praise the governor for this infusion of money and that infusion of money, but you and I were talking before coming on the program, and for essentially the state university, the funding has remained flat.
Yeah, I'm very concerned about where priorities are. And higher education is one of the most important, should be one of the most important priorities in the state, because not only does it crank out the future leaders of the state and a more educated citizenry, which are both laudable things by themselves, they're also little mini economic engines which drive the local economies around them. So, the college students, of course, run around and eat pizza and drink beer or whatever they do all day, but also the employees.
I think that's about right.
The employees of the college work there and live in the community and pay taxes and own homes. And so when you look at the amount of money, if you invest $1 into a state university, the state gets somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 back in terms of increased economic activity. And yet the state blows billions of dollars on things like Tesla. And,
remind people what that's about.
Yeah, I mean, basically the idea was the state was going to underwrote the construction of a factory in the Buffalo area that would be run by Tesla that was going to create, among other things, solar shingles and stuff for people's homes, which of course is a great idea and that makes sense, but it doesn't work out and they're not creating the jobs. And in fact, they're, subcontracting a lot of the work out of Buffalo. So effectively, that money got wasted, or at least a portion of it.
Not the first time we've seen these kind of boondoggles.
And there's so many so-called economic development projects as the state spends big bucks on that are poorly thought through, and they're really rewarding the press release that's going to go out and the ribbon that's going to get cut. Meanwhile, the meat and potatoes of keeping colleges afloat in New York and doing what they're supposed to be doing gets shortchanged. And so you're seeing private colleges shut down. You're seeing public colleges reducing their programs and shutting programs because they're losing potential students from coming to their schools. And all of this stuff is happening. And yet, they just whistle past the graveyard, policymakers. To me, it's an upside down sort of look at the world. It doesn't make any sense. Why not use the money that you're blowing on things like Tesla to keep these colleges going?
Well, while we're speaking about colleges, what's your sense of the protests, the pro-Palestinian protests on college campuses and some of the response and how those officials have handled it?
Well, I mean, I have no particular expertise on the Middle East. I mean, that's, an area of the world that has been, contentious for as long as humans have lived there. But colleges should allow for peaceful protest, and that is that you have a free speech right to express your point of view, no matter how much people that run the college like it or hate it.
I got to tell you, as an adjunct and having students who are engaged and know what's going on in the world and are activating themselves, that's like a practicum course in society.
No, that's absolutely right. And yet, the people that don't protest and the people that want to go to class, they have rights too.
They do.
And they shouldn't be discriminated. People shouldn't be discriminated against. So, I mean, personally, I'm opposed to murder and war. So I certainly understand why people have strong views on what's happening in the Middle East. I think they should have a right to express those views, but the rights should be done in a way that protect the rights of the people that aren't participating in the protests. I mean, I think it's important for people, young people, to express their point of view. When I was in college, I did too. There was this thing called Vietnam happening. I get it. The colleges, I think how they handle it, it's hard to tell because all you can tell is what you read in the papers, and that tends to be sensationalized to some extent. And so I think as long as the powers that be, when it comes to higher education, are protecting the free speech rights of people who want to protest, the protests are peaceful, and the lives of those who are not participating in terms of going to class and being able to sleep at night and not being threatened are all protected, that's the way it should play out.
Well, we've played this one out. We're out of time, Blair. He is Blair Horner. He is the executive director of NYPIRG, the New York Public Interest Research Group, www.nypirg.org. Blair, I can't thank you enough for being on the Capital Connection, and I can pretty much guarantee I won't wait 45 more years until we have you back on.
Well, please don't, because if it's 45 years from now, you might be talking to something very quiet.
We'll leave it there.
The Capital Connection is a production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. You can listen to The Capital Connection anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcast. And join us again next week at this same time for another political conversation. For The Capital Connection, I'm David Guistina.
Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative.